Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening event at the EFZ. Also, everyone who joins us through the Zoomosphere, welcome to this talk. It's a great pleasure to have with us today, directly from the city of London to Munich, Jason Burke. Jason Burke, who made a career as a journalist with The Guardian and its Sunday paper, The Observer. After studying at Oxford, I think. What did you actually study in Oxford? History. Okay, yeah. So fellow historians.
Modern history. I feel very at home.
Excellent. Historian from Oxford, but then went the journalist route, and I think very cleverly integrated the analytical eye of the historian with the weaseling spirit of an investigative journalist. And this is actually how I first came across your name, was as a young undergraduate student in Zurich. I read your book about Al-Qaeda. I think it was almost 20 years ago.
21.
When I read it. It wasn't exactly. And then kind of didn't think too much about you anymore until some day in summer 2020 during Corona, where you kind of sent me an email asking whether we could talk about a project of yours. And that was kind of this moment when one of your youth idols starts to reach out to you and ask whether he could talk to you, which was quite a fascinating moment.
That's very nice to hear. Thank you.
But I still think that your book about Al-Qaeda is actually the best book written so far about Al-Qaeda, including...
It's certainly the best book I've written. The other ones were very good. No.
Okay, yeah, but there were some follow-up books after that on mostly about Islamism, on Islamist terrorism.
9/11.
9/11 wars as well. But you traveled the world. You used your opportunity as a journalist. You were stationed in New Delhi. When we were talking in 2020, I think you were talking from Johannesburg.
Yeah.
So you really traveled the world as a correspondent for The Guardian. Now you're back in London, but still writing as an international security correspondent for The Guardian. You were frequently in Israel, also covering the current conflict in the Middle East for the paper.
Yeah.
But the project we're going to talk to about now is the project you were reaching out to me back in 2020. And I think that was in its very infancy. Today, it's 5 days away from going to the publisher.
Yeah, about that. Yeah, Monday.
And we're very proud to have the first public speak about this research. We have a global premiere tonight. Talking about this project of transnational violence from basically the period, these 15 years more or less, from the Six-Day War in 1967 to the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, and how the scene of revolutionary violence, terrorist violence, changed profoundly during these 15 years. To go directly into the topic, perhaps, I mean, why should we, particularly you who look more at contemporary events in your career, why should we look at terrorism in the 1970s? Why should we spend time researching these people who were active more than 50 years ago?
Thank you for that kind and generous introduction. And particularly about the point about being a historian, or at least half a historian, a profession for which I retain great respect and affection, and would love to have been a historian if I could put up with being in archives for so long, in the same room, in the same library, which was beyond me when I was in my 20s. Now it sounds rather pleasant, but so I have great respect for all historians, and I'm very happy to see so many of you here to this evening. I hope I don't disappoint. But my interest in this period and this topic is an essentially historical one, that of a historian. I've written extensively about the rise of Islamism as we know it now, Islamic extremists, Islamist extremism, and political and religious violence. My book on Al-Qaeda came out in 2003, and it charted the rise of that phenomenon in the 1990s. And subsequently, I wrote a book which looked at what happened in the decade after that, so up until the death of bin Laden in 2011. And had always been fascinated by what had come much before that phenomenon. So if we look at the roots of Al-Qaeda, which was formed in 1988, the roots go back obviously much longer to really the period we're talking about, the mid-60s. So the project started almost as if I was writing the prequel, as they call it in Hollywood, to a story that we all know quite well. I mean, to put it in rather perhaps overly simple terms, if I'd written the Star Wars sort of 5, is it, or 2, I was writing the 1 and the stories, the earlier stories. That's what I was interested in. And some of it obviously was involved events that I thought I was quite familiar with, such as Munich, such as the Entebbe raid of 76, the big bombs in, or the Lebanese war and the big bombs against the US there, which I dimly remember. I was 12 in 82. And these things I thought I sort of knew. And when I started looking at them, I found that I really didn't know. And I needed to know much more. And what I also found absolutely fascinating was how there was a clear narrative, story to be told from the mid-60s through to the mid-80s, where in the mid to late 60s, you have a wave of political violence, political extremism in multiple different forms, which has a major international aspect, though is often considered nationally, that a wave that crests, that peaks, that is at its biggest in the early 70s, around the time of Munich, and starts to lose its energy and its scale and its power quite quickly, both in practical terms and in ideological terms. And what follows it in the West is either nothing, like in Britain, for example, or very little, such as in France, or much less in Germany. In the Middle East, you have something as much more dangerous and much more tenacious and that emerges, which is that wave of Islamic militancy that I was talking about. So I was very interested in looking at how, in many ways, this first wave of leftist, progressive, secular violence and extremism and activism failed, or at least ended, and how in the Middle East it was replaced by something else, whereas in the West a very different phenomenon took place. And that to me seemed to say something important about how terrorism emerges, why it emerges, and how it can be resolved, or at least mitigated, so lessened. I'll just say one more thing, and that is that in approaching it, I decided that I wanted to look not so much as the why people become involved in terrorism, but the how, the process. And the best way to do that was to look at individuals. So the book I've done is a series of interlinked biographies of people, some of whom you will have heard of, such as the first person I think we're going to talk about, and some of whom you absolutely won't have done, but are in my view, and I know in Adrian's view too, key players. And in fact, we haven't got a picture of Bruno, have we?
We should have
a picture of Brege, who's really interesting, but we can talk about him anyway. So the book I've done is for a popular audience, for general readers, which is why I've concentrated on people, but also because those stories, as a historical approach, the kind of micro history of those people, I think is a really interesting and valuable one. And I hand over to you.
Yeah, I had definitely that same impression when I could have a look at parts of your manuscript, and going through the first 100 or so pages, I was reminded of a very theoretical article I wrote a couple years ago, one of those that maybe 5.5 people read, and I was kind of making the case that an interesting concept to look at transnational violence in the 20th century would be through that lens of the alliance hub, and that you have an alliance hub surrounded by a cluster, and that in the central node of that cluster, you have an organization or several organizations that are connected to numerous organizations in that cluster, but that also serve as some sort of broker and provide the central link between certain other organizations in that cluster. And when I read your manuscript, I totally read this as a very well-researched, detailed, and lucid case study of such a cluster, a Palestinian cluster surrounded by organizations in Latin America, and a Palestinian alliance hub, of course, surrounded by a cluster of organizations in Latin America and Western Europe, even in Japan. So my question would be, what do you think are the defining elements of the relationship between this Palestinian alliance hub and the organizations around the world that constituted this relationship cluster?
It's quite an interesting way of looking at it. What I tried to do in the first sections of the book is summon up, or to portray the fact that events, the terrorist attacks of that period, including Munich, but also some of the other big ones, and the come out of the Palestinian, what they call the armed struggle, and that their model and their ideological worldview was hugely influenced by a much broader revolutionary moment historically, in culturally, ideologically, and practically. So they were looking to, in the late 60s, they were looking at the Cubans, the Algerians, the Vietnamese, above all, as models for how they could behave. And those ideological links were translated into genuine organizational links, which connected in a very real way the Japanese Red Army, for example, with the Nicaraguan Sandinista via the Middle East. And the locus of that connection was, really interestingly, the training camps in Jordan and then latterly in Lebanon, where you have an extraordinary mixture of individuals from Western Europe, from the Middle East, so from the Kurds, Iranian dissidents, Algerians to a lesser extent, Palestinians, obviously. You also have Nicaraguans and Sandinista being sent by the Sandinista. And we can get into that when we talk about some of the people. So
maybe we start with the first.
Yeah, we'll start with our first. So I'm sure everybody recognises Leila Khalid, who I spoke to for probably a total of about 12 hours about her version of her life. And I say that because she's repeated it so many times that when you speak to her, what you get is almost one person's own official biography if that makes sense. It's quite an interesting historical experience because I then obviously went off and checked everything she said. And, broadly, it all checks out. I mean, she doesn't embellish, doesn't create or lie, fabricate. But it's quite selective and it's highly political. And this was one of the methodological challenges that I faced doing this kind of work with a lot of oral history, basically, which is not unfamiliar to anyone, journalist or historian. So the interesting thing about Leila Khalid is obviously the kind of meta image. And what we were talking about earlier today is how with this image, in a sense, this is exactly 50 years later, what, not Leila Khalid, who was only 26 at the time and very junior, but the people who were much more senior in the PFLP wanted back then. This is the iconic image that they absolutely went out and created. And that it almost to the extent where the hijackings that she was engaged in were secondary to the creation of the image, or were aimed at allowing this image to be constructed, a hugely powerful icon which says an awful lot, or said then an awful lot, and still does, about the Palestinian cause, about the PFLP and what they wanted to achieve. So what interests me here is the use of violence to create what is effectively a propaganda image. I mean, it really is propaganda by deed. I know, Adrian, you had some things to say about the actual details on it, about the kafir and so forth.
Yeah, I think you have a lot of the iconic elements here, starting with the AK-47 that she holds. And I know they deliberately, the PFLP seniors, put that AK-47 in her hand when the photo shoot happened. So as kind of the symbol of that wave of revolutionary violence that you described from Latin America all the way through the Middle East. And I think noticeable is also the ring that she wears, which is basically a bullet shell from a AK-47, from a Kalashnikov weapon, which symbolizes, I guess, her marriage with the revolution per se, and particularly with the Palestinian revolution. And I think you researched quite a bit on the kafir, so maybe you want to explain us.
So yeah, the kafir is interesting as well, because it says various things. For a start, it wasn't, and still then certainly still isn't, traditionally worn by a woman. So immediately the PFLP are making the point that they are progressive, looking to break social hierarchies, particularly with gender. The reason that Leila Khalid ended up with the PFLP, she told me, is that she wanted to join Fatah, which is much more traditional, much more hierarchical, and much more sexist. So when she asked to have a combat role in Fatah, she was told there's no way you will have a combat role. You can go and look after martyrs and do social work. And she said, I don't want to be a social worker, I want to be a fighter. And she was basically told, well, you're not in this organization. Initially, the PFLP were reluctant to allow her a front line role. But at a certain point after 67 into about mid-68, Wadi Haddad, the deputy leader, or certainly the leader of the hijackings and the external operations, decided that he wanted to make this spectacular point that the PFLP was international, was in tune with the kind of zeitgeist of the 1960s, and that the spirit of that time in terms of gender, that they were prepared to do something that would genuinely attract a lot of attention and use women in that role. And so she was allowed to go and train and join in the next operation. And there's some really amusing stories about what happened when she was training and how she got very angry with Western female volunteers who were coming into the camps and then discussing their boyfriends. This is her words. And she said to me, I mean, what were they doing discussing boyfriends? And this is about revolution. I'm not interested in, that's their business. I'm an Arab girl. I don't have boyfriends. And there were these sort of conflicts in the camps. But the point about that, the keffiyeh is, she's wearing the keffiyeh, so that's a big point. She's got a gun, the AK, the iconic AK. But also, there's something else that interests me. This picture doesn't quite show it. She's smiling broadly in this picture. In the original, she's not smiling as much. She's looking quite determined. She's also looking down, and the keffiyeh is pulled higher. So it's actually also a headscarf. It's also an image of, she's not bareheaded. She has, like a good traditional in the late 1960s Arab woman, she has her head covered. So there's an ambivalence there as well, which is playing to different audiences, publics. And one of the reasons I think that's really interesting is because it really shows what Adrian was just talking about, was how this was constructed as an image, to the point where when Khaled decided she'd had enough of the publicity that followed her first hijacking, and she pretended she wasn't at home when a French film crew turned up to do an interview. She was rung directly by George Habash, the leader of the PFLP, and told off. He was very angry and said, "Don't ever do that again. The struggle, the publicity is the struggle. That is that is why you're here." So that's a really interesting. I think that's why that is such an interesting image. And to see it here, that's actually in Bethlehem, isn't it?
Yeah, it's on the wall in Bethlehem.
Yeah, that much later is really good. Let me see if I can manage this now.
Get that?
Yay!
Yeah, I find that really fascinating. That image with the keffiyeh that was more like a traditional headscarf in the original image, which we didn't properly see in this image.
Well, the fact that
it's kind of symbol of the ambiguity of the relation these revolutionary progressive violent groups had with women and their attitudes towards women or their role in the armed struggle. And I think you also looked a little bit into that in terms of the different Western European leftist terrorist groups and the ambiguous role. What is your outtake on that?
Well, I think the outtake is that certainly there's plenty of evidence that in Germany and in France and elsewhere, there was a real problem with kind of macho, very sexist, often predatory sexual behavior within the militant groups. There's certainly evidence of that within the Red Army faction and the German groups. There's lots of accounts. The French as well, and in the various communes. So I think the basic takeaway is that terrorist groups or extremist groups reflect very often, if not the broader social cultures of the time, much broader subcultures at the time. And there was the revolutionary movement of the late 60s had a significant feminist component. But what's interesting is how this is one of the reasons I'm in the book, it breaks apart very fast. And by the even 72, 73, the feminist struggle has been carved away from the broader revolutionary struggle. And you have organizations that are emerging purely for women in a way that you didn't earlier. This is Patrick Arguello, who is, this is one of the few pictures of him actually. Again, he's really interesting because he really represents the internationalism of that early phase of the the first wave of the Palestinian groups' terrorism. He was with Layla Khaled in 1970 when they tried to hijack an El Al flight from Schiphol from Israel via Schiphol to New York, and he was killed, and he died in an ambulance in Britain in front of Khaled, having been shot by an Israeli armed Shin Bet agent, security agent on the plane. But he's really interesting. I won't go too deeply into his background, but he was a dual US Nicaraguan citizen. He got very involved with the Sandinista. He had to flee Nicaragua after making a particularly ill-advised speech in which he called on the students in Managua to basically rise up in an armed revolt, which, given that it was run by a nasty repressive dictatorship at the time, wasn't very clever. So he had to flee. He ended up in Geneva, where the Sandinista had a lot of activists hiding, and was basically recruited to join Khaled in this hijacking operation in September 1970, which is the multiple hijacking, which ended up with 3 planes on the in the desert in Jordan, which is this one. Arguello and Khaled tried to take over a plane which they were meant to fly here, which is Zaka, a place called Zaka, just about 15, 20, 25 miles outside, 25 kilometers outside Amman in Jordan. They obviously didn't make it. They got the hijacking went wrong, and Khaled ended up in prison in Britain, or in a police station in Britain, and Arguello was killed. But they ended up with 3 other planes there in Jordan on the ground. And this is the end of it, obviously. And what's interesting is how it ended, because how this kind of operation, terrorist operation, ended at this moment is in 1970 is very, very different from 10 or 15 years later. And that's one of the things I was really interested in exploring in the book. Adrian, do you want to talk about what we've got here?
At that moment it's typical for that moment in the history of Palestinian terrorism, because actually no one died. There were more than 300 hostages in the brutal heat of the Jordanian desert for several days, some of them several weeks. And at the end of it, there was no casualties. They actually evacuated the planes before they set the explosives. And basically, Wadi Haddad, you talked about him already, organized a film crew, a filmman and a photographer, brought him out from Amman into the desert and had this very deliberately, like put him into the sand, and then they exploded the planes and created this image for consumption of the Western public, so to speak, to create an image of the Middle East conflict, of the Palestinian liberation movement for Western audiences. It was like Layla Khaled's image. It was very deliberately constructed so that the terrorist attack was, to some degree, also here merely a stage for a spectacular image that was supposed to reframe for a Western audience what the Palestinians and their struggle meant. And there were no casualties needed at that time. You didn't have to kill someone at that time to deliver that message. And I think you describe very interestingly in your book how at that time in media history the footage, the images actually made it from the Jordanian desert to the television stations in the West. Maybe you want to...
Yeah, it's very interesting to compare this with Munich, because here they had to physically take the film out of the cameras. They took it to Amman. They flew it. They chartered a plane to fly it to Cyprus. It was flown from Cyprus to Rome, I think it was partially edited in Rome. Then it was transferred with another flight to London, and they got it onto news bulletins just about 24 hours later, than like the nighttime news. It then, again, the physical thing was flown across the Atlantic with kind of like the time zone, 6-hour flight, and the time zone sort of 5-hour behind. So it could just about get to the US and get on their late night, very late night bulletins. But it was a totally physical process of actually having to carry this film around and physically cut it together and splice it to broadcast it. And it did get broadcast to tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people probably. So in that, it was very effective. And you can still see it, actually. The forecast is on YouTube, and you can see the footage. But the contrast with that, and just 2 years later, when you have famously the world's first live broadcast from Munich, is a really interesting one, and says a lot about this period of very rapid technological change, particularly in media terms, that all of this took place in, and without which it probably couldn't have. Well, certainly couldn't have taken the same form, and it probably wouldn't have developed in the same way. Wadi Haddad, who we've spoken about several times, was continually looking for new ways of getting media attention. And when they didn't get it, was clearly disappointed. They were watching Western broadcasts, they were watching Western newspapers, and were concerned and angry when they didn't get the attention that they believed they should be getting. And another thing that is worth holding in mind is, during this crisis, they were holding press conferences on the sand in front of the planes, where they would get the hostages out, and the hostages would all stand there with their captors, and journalists would come in, and they were all talking to each other, and microphones, and meanwhile the PFLP would be there with a loudhailer, a loudspeaker, bullhorn, getting out their message, engaging with the journalists, or having press conferences, sitting like we're sitting now. And there's some great photographs of the leaders of the PFLP, the DFLP, Fatah, various others, all in a row, answering questions direct from the journalists. And the contrast, again, with what happens just 10 years later is very significant. And somebody who is very interested in media is this chap, who is, everybody will recognise, Carlos. Well, in my book, I call him Ilich Ramirez Sanchez, because that is his name. It's not actually Carlos. So I made an editorial decision that every other book he's Carlos.
Not in mine.
Not in yours, no. Okay, so we're on the same name. So we both call him by his name because, yes, but I obviously did it because I'd read your article. But why call him Carlos? I mean, it just glamorizes him, and he was an idiot. I mean, he's a really detestable human being, who, in addition to being, borderline psychopath, is also very bad at what he does. I can forgive many things, but incompetence in somebody like that is quite is as bad as anything else. I mean, he's really, but the reason he gets away with everything, he gets away with basically neither being an effective terrorist or being, and while being an absolutely awful human being. He gets away with it because he manipulates the media so brilliantly, and as Adrian has written about a lot, is allowed to, indeed encouraged to, manipulate the media. And that image, you'll see it multicolored, and it was famously on the front cover of the Spiegel, 1975.
Possible. Certainly also the New Yorker.
New Yorker, and around then. I think the first one where they coloured it up was certainly one of the big German weeklies, and Ramirez saw that. He saw it when he was in Algeria, I think, after the OPEC attack, so December 75, and he loved it. And he carries around with him his cuttings, all his press cuttings, all filed. Mind you, the Red Army faction did the same in Stamheim, so it's a pretty common thing. But he had his, and it saves him. I would argue, I mean, others were different. It saves him again and again and again. This myth brings him enormous benefits. He learns how to play with it. So he can, when he's about to be ejected, or he's about to be fired by Wadi Haddad from the PFLP, he's able to say, do you really want to fire the famous Carlos? And, Haddad has to think about it because it's quite a big step. With the Iraqis or the Syrians or the Libyans, who he all works with at one stage or another, it's his selling point, it's his marketing, basically. He can't do half of what he says he can do, but he's got the image. He's the world's super terrorist. And that's really important.
And becomes Carlos, the Jackal, at some point.
Well,
like this larger-than-life figure. And I think it's interesting that you mentioned the OPEC attack of December 1975, because Carlos really tries to copy Che Guevara during this attack. Now he wears the beret and the big sideburns and kind of tries to copy Che Guevara. And this is what happens with this photo, not who kind of similar as Alberto Corda's the kind of iconic image of Che Guevara. This gets reproduced and manipulated hundreds and hundreds of times. You have it in the 70s and early 80s. You find it on T-shirts. You find it on CD covers, on oil paintings, graffitis on the walls in the Middle East and Europe, even on bed linen. I found it. So
the Che Guevara.
This one in the same Warholization style as the Corda photograph of Che Guevara.
Album covers. The Che Guevara one though is also. I mean, it was. I don't know what it was like here, but I mean, when I was a kid, I was born in 1970, so I was just past this. But the idea that every single student had a poster of Che Guevara on their wall was kind of true. I mean, not my generation, because we were all the 80s, so it was different. But 10 years earlier, or certainly 15 years earlier, it was true. And it made me laugh sometimes how often it would come up. So the 77 Lufthansa hijacking, famously, the hijackers take over the plane wearing kind of normal equipment, normal clothes rather, and then they change into Che Guevara t-shirts. And when I was looking at a picture of Ulrike Meinhof after her arrest, when she'd just been arrested and she's sitting on the teacher actually in his flat, his apartment, left-wing teacher who'd actually told the police where she was, but had previously been quite involved with the RAF. On the wall behind her, there is a Che Guevara poster. And the strength of the image of Che Guevara was so powerful and taken. And I think what's interesting, it was really taken literally. So Arguello, who we were just talking about, he explicitly talks about the loss of Che Guevara in 1967 when he's killed as something that was enormously personally important to him, and that he, how many more must die? And he writes this long letter full of sort of idealistic statements and promises. But he does end up going off to Palestine, to the PLO camps in Jordan and training. So
this is something I found very interesting in your book, that like the literature so far has been often dominated, especially the popular literature, on the material connection between the different organizations around the world, their mutual support in training, logistic weapons, and similar things. But what you also look into, and I found that very refreshing, is the ideal transfers and exchanges among these groups, that there is an exchange, transfer of revolutionist ideas, concepts, and strategies also, and one that you discuss is the Fouquismo, the Foucault strategy, which brings us back to Che Guevara, and how Che Guevara's theory of revolution, that a small cadre of revolutionaries, preferably somewhere in the countryside, in the mountains, is the core, the nucleus of the revolution, and that kind of a shortcut of the traditional Marxist theory that you need to raise the consciousness of the masses and of the working class over several hardworking years, and that theory really was influential in making its way over the Atlantic. Maybe you can tell us a little bit.
Yeah, the photo. That's a very good link to the next slide, which is this one, which I love these guys. This is the Fedayeen Khalq. That's Farsi, and we've actually says up there. It's brilliant. The People's Fedayeen Guerrillas. The 8th year was the initiation of the armed struggle. So this is the main violent leftist vanguardist organization in Iran in the 70s, and they are fully paid up followers of Che. They are very classic in their sort of new left ideas. They don't like the Communist Party, Iranian Communist Party today, because it's much too hierarchical. And as Adrian says, they don't want to wait until the objective conditions are right for revolution in the classic Marxist dialectic sense. They believe that, as was shown in Cuba, that a few committed individuals with particularly automatic weapons can create the objective conditions through violence themselves. And they seek to put this into action. So they're not a particularly big organization. They're recruited among students mainly. I enjoyed very much researching them, partly because I met some fantastic people, including their former leader, a man called Farouk Negadar, who was head of the organization from 1977 to 1983 or 4 in Iran, and now lives in London, which was convenient. So I could go and see him and have fantastic Iranian food talking about the 1970s. It was perfect. And he told me his entire story, and he told me about the organization. But one of the really interesting things about the organization is that they've been completely forgotten. I mean, if you're all experts, but if you ask most people who was the opposition, who led the opposition to the Shah and the Pahlavi regime in Iran in the 1970s, the answer will be Khomeini and the radical clerics. Khomeini was in Najaf. He wasn't even in Iran. The clerics were not actually committed to a violent campaign at all. And Khomeini believed that the revolution would come when his ideas and those of his brand of Shia, politicized Shia Islam, spread sufficiently through the population that there would be mass protests, the regime would fall almost non-violently. These were the people who were actually leading a genuine violent campaign against the Shah, and were seen by the Savak, the security service, as the primary threat to the regime, albeit one that they dismissed as relatively minor. Now, their attempt at Che Guevara's Foucaultism, we were talking about this on the way up here, took place in 1971 in a place called Siakhal, up in northern Iran, in the mountains. And they went up into the mountains and they thought what they could do is do exactly what Che had done, and they thought the Algerians had done, and they thought the Palestinians were trying, and they thought that the Vietnamese had succeeded with, and it is important to underline the impact of the example of the Vietnamese war, who were fighting a superpower after all. But they sent 11 men, including one who was who had been trained, one who'd just got back from Lebanon, where he'd been in PLO camps and came back with the totemic, iconic AK, or at least an automatic weapon, and some training. And they launched their attack on a police post, a rural gendarmerie post, up in the mountains, in the forests in northern Iran. And they thought this would light the fuse for a general explosion across Iran, a people's war in Iran that would lead to the fall of the Shah. And they were, of course, completely wrong. And it was a total debacle. It failed. The 11 were all rounded up and shot. The main problem was that the villagers, who were supposed to rise up in solidarity, wanted absolutely nothing to do with this bunch of Marxist intellectuals who'd come from Tehran and were calling on them to fight the police and the state, collaborated or cooperated with the local security services, and the whole thing ended. And Farrokh told me about this amazing walk he went on with the man who had the strategist behind this attack, man called Hamid Ashraf, who was known as the Che Guevara of Iran. And the two of them went for this hike in the mountains to get away from the surveillance and so forth. And they were talking about what had gone wrong. And they stopped in this deserted cow shed, basically, for the night. And they cooked themselves some food on a fire. And they looked up, and on the wall of this shed, this peasant's shed, there was a nailed portrait of the Ayatollah Khomeini. And Farrokh said, he told me how he turned to Hamid Ashraf, who was his best friend, and said, we are students, we are educated, we have the right ideas, we know the truth. Why are the peasants, why has he got Khomeini on his wall? And Hamid Ashraf said, I can't answer that question. And that's just really an interesting glimpse into the problems of Foucaultism. And don't forget that, Foucaultism worked to an extent in Cuba, but it then went very badly wrong in Bolivia. Well, it went wrong elsewhere too, but it went very badly wrong for Che Guevara in Bolivia.
I remember a ridiculous adaptation in Spain in the early 60s where the Popular Liberation Front tried to recreate a Foucault situation in rural Andalusia and start a guerrilla war against the Franco regime. But anyway,
I did actually find a reference in Samba. I'm not sure which one it is. You're someone he'll probably be able to tell me, probably either. There was to a small group of Foucaultist German students who decided that they could launch their attack by the new campaign to, with recruitment in Bavarian discotheques in about 1971. And I think that was equally successful.
That sounds fascinating. If someone has information on that application of the
I'll find the reference.
Yeah, but what I find fascinating or interesting about that example, if we zoom out to the bigger picture and with the Fedaine Khalq, is that they also kind of represent or symbolize this shift, which is a key argument of your book, from the left-wing, mostly secular revolutionary violence of the 70s that you argue failed by the end or had failed by the end of the decade, and then was kind of succeeded by a very different form of terrorist violence connected to Islamist ideals.
Like the guy we're about to see. Should we go on to him?
Yeah.
So,
Juhayman.
Yeah, this is Juhayman al-Taiba, 1979. This picture would have been taken in December 1979. And the reason he's here is because it's exactly contemporaneous with the Iranian Revolution. So for me, the Iranian Revolution shows very clearly what happens when there is a leftist group, these guys, who by 1977 have been completely destroyed. They recover from Siakal in this 1971 failure. They go on to launch 6 years of further attacks. By 77, none of them are left. They're virtually all in prison. Farouk was in prison. Everybody else is in prison. And that means that when the Iranian regime starts to weaken, the only real opposition there is an opportunity for Khomeini to step in. And he does that. And one of the reasons it is an Iranian Islamic revolution is because the Fedayeen don't exist any longer. And that big leftist component has failed, in my view. Others may feel differently. At the same time, you're beginning to see the real evidence of what's happening elsewhere in terms of the Islamic resurgence across the Middle East. So Juhaman al-Taiba leads an attempt to take over the Great Mosque of Mecca, and in so doing bring about, allow a new Messiah to emerge on earth, who happens to be his cousin and one of his followers, and therefore usher in a new era of Islamic peace, justice, social justice, accountability, and Armageddon, basically, apocalypse. And it fails, but it gives the Saudi monarchy a very nasty moment. And coming at the same time as it does in 79 as the Iranian Revolution, the largely religiously inspired uprising in Afghanistan, what is also happening elsewhere in the Middle East, it is the first real sign of the power that is being generated by the Islamist movement in both across the Middle East, in both its Shia manifestation or Shia forms and its various Sunni forms.
There is an interesting connection, or there's some connection to Munich as well with the siege of the Great Mosque, because right after Munich, a couple of Western countries started to, for the first time, build up some anti-terrorist specialized intervention groups, and so did the French. And in 1973, they built their first kind of like a specialized police force for difficult hostage situation and anti-terrorist operations. And their first mission abroad was in November 1979, when they led the counteroffensive against the Great Siege. They also brought the chemical weapons from France to the Saudis, the gas that were used against the occupiers. So it was basically a French operation from the French anti-terrorist forces, which were the equivalent of the GSG 9 in Deutschland, and created at the same time after Munich, after the disaster of Munich. So there is some lineage to the Great Mosque, which always stuns me how much neglected this key event is in academic literature.
It's really important.
And this interesting personal line from Juhayman, after the execution, his followers were joined by a certain person called Makdizi, which you're certainly aware of, who became a follower of the Juhayman's group, and who later would meet in prison in Jordan a certain man called Musa as-Zarqawi. And Zarqawi obviously would be the person who would found the group in Iraq that would become ISIS. So there is only one person between Juhayman and Zarqawi who would found ISIS in the early 2000s.
Which is a good moment to go to this one. So that's Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was the leader of Al-Qaeda from 2011 to 2021. But here is pictured in, I think that will be December 1982, after the assassination of Anwar Sadat in Egypt, in a cage in a courtroom. Now, he wasn't directly involved with the assassination, but he was involved very heavily in violent Islamic activism at the time. Didn't have prior knowledge of the assassination, but and if he disapproved of it, it was only because he felt it was premature. But even at this stage, he was very committed to a jihadist vision. And this is early, this is 1982. He'd already been to Peshawar, he'd already been to Pakistan twice when he was arrested, and ended up, he was tortured, forced to betray his closest associates. And this is a picture of a speech he gave in the courtroom. And one of the things that's interesting about this speech is, again, we're back in the media space. It's an amazing speech. There's a very good account of it in Lawrence Wright's The Looming Tower. And it is absolutely pure, the rhetoric that we associate with Al-Qaeda.
It's in English, actually. He speaks in English. Yeah.
Which is amazing. And it's directed at a foreign audience, and it's the first time for me that language is heard in such an open context. And again, you have this progression of the Iranian Revolution, 79, then you have the Juhayman and the siege of Mecca, you have the assassination of Sadat very shortly afterwards, and then we're building towards basically that, which is October 1983 and a massive truck bomb, suicide truck bomb, that destroys the US Marine barracks in Beirut, killing upwards of 300 people, US Marines for the most part. Single biggest explosion, non-nuclear explosion, the FBI reckoned ever at the time. Hugely destructive, designed to level a building, to kill as many people as possible, many hundreds. Another bomb detonated simultaneously outside French paratroopers barracks. Didn't kill as many because the driver was shot before he got close enough, but it still killed 50 or 60. These are massive, massive devices. There was no warning given. There were no press conferences. There was no film taken or journalists summoned. They were suicide bombs. They were directed at the US, which was new, directly at the US. And they were really the beginning of what we have now. And that's why I kind of end my book with them, because I said it was a prequel. That's sort of the point that you get to in 1983 with these. At the same time, there is a certain Osama bin Laden who is in Pakistan and makes his first trip into Afghanistan. You have the thought and the ideology of people like Juhayman spreading more and more widely. You have very considerable violence in Syria. You have the Hezbollah's foundation and the rise of Hezbollah in Lebanon, and you have a general resurgence and rise of very radical, very violent jihadism. And the point that I think Adrian was we were both making early on, is quite how different this is from, I won't go all the way back, but from, well, yeah, actually this from that, yeah, that they took everyone off the planes, made sure no one was actually hurt. No one was actually hurt. None of the, as Adrian said, none of there were no actual casualties apart from Arguello, who he was the only person who died, apart from in the hijackings in a narrow sense. through to this. And I suppose my point I'm trying to make in the book is, and this is, I think, quite important, is that, if you don't, obviously where are we? Let's go to that. This isn't necessarily about the Palestinians. It's not about what Aguero is fighting for. It's not about that nationalist struggle. But what it is about is revolution in the sense of a radical transformation, a genuinely radical and extreme change that Hezbollah wanted to see in Lebanon, the Iranian regime that was behind them wanted to see globally, and an ideology that was dedicated to massive transformation of societies and politics. And that's where you end up, having started at the very beginning with something very different. If the circumstances don't change and one ideological route is shut down or destroyed, then another ideological route will be found. And I think that is the point I'm trying to make with the book. And I think looking at the individuals who we've looked at over the last 45 minutes is a good way of doing that.
Interesting. I think it's very, very tangible how it can be broken down to certain key individuals that show some lines of transition, whether it is through Juhayman, Maktizi, Zarqawi, or through al-Zawahiri and the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. One episode that I found particularly ironic, but really symbolizes this kind of transition, is your description of the murder of Anwar Sadat in October 1981, because a few months before, the Libyan leader al-Gaddafi actually handed out a contract to kill Sadat to Carlos the Jackal, or Ilich Ramirez Sanchez, and his group of revolutionaries, so-called revolutionaries, left-wing revolutionaries, who were based in Eastern Europe at that time. And they miserably failed. They couldn't pull it off. And it was actually some Egyptian local Islamists who killed Sadat. And I think the whole irony, the whole transition is kind of symbolized in that event, that the old-styled, decaying, morally bankrupt left-wing revolutionaries, so to speak, failed. And it was Islamists who actually killed Sadat.
Yeah, and that's certainly true in the Middle East. And it's really interesting to contrast that with what happened in Western Europe. Obviously, hugely different context, but in Western Europe, you have the same wave of political violence in the early 70s that peaks in Germany in mid-70s, different timescales elsewhere. But you have this wave of violence. In Italy, it's slightly different, but generally, by the early 80s, it's over. And my argument would be it's over because quite a lot of the core demands have been met of the broader ideological movement, of which the violent element was simply the extreme part. In the Middle East, none of those demands of the broader movement, of which the violent element was just a fringe, none of those demands, those grievances, have been answered at all. And so if you have that vacuum after the failures of Arab nationalism, the failures of the other progressive or leftist ideologies, their active repression and destruction by successive regimes and governments, then that vacuum will be filled. And there are other things happening, identity politics, the rise of a new religious resurgence globally, but that vacuum will be filled. And there are other characters we didn't talk about, like Ali Hassan Salameh, who is a very westernized, very a key aide to security official for Yasser Arafat, but he was killed in 1979 shortly after sitting down and negotiating around a table with the representative of the German government and the Austrian government, negotiating kind of intelligence sharing pacts, really, with the PLO, the Palestinians. and the Israelis killed him in 79. And it's always struck me as he died in January 79, and the 29th or something, and Khomeini returned to Tehran 2 days later. And it's just, if you know, the Israelis killed this one guy and they weren't looking at what was happening, you know, 1,000 or so miles east, where they were about to get a much, much worse enemy. So, you know, that's the takeaway.
If you look back at the barracks attacks in Beirut in October 83, there's also one person, a key person involved there that also personifies really this transformation. I'm talking about Imad Mughniya. Maybe you can explain a little bit. He's a really fascinating person because he comes also from Fatah, secular, conservative, I would say bourgeois.
Honestly, very briefly. So Imad Mughniya becomes the kind of bête noire of the Americans and is blamed for lots of big attacks. But he's been blamed for this attack, for 83 barracks attack. I think he's probably been created a bit like Carlos was, a bit like Bin Laden was, as the individual that you can pin lots of failures on, because this one guy is like the super guy. I don't think, because he was only 21 at the time of these attacks. It's very unlikely that he played such a central. He was
still with Arafat in late 82, so he was very new. And
he was still with Arafat, but the one thing that is interesting, I can talk about him for ages, he's really interesting, but also that's where he gets lots of other people. But basically, he was, the main thing was he's a Shia who was with Fatah, he was with a Palestinian, he's Lebanese, but he's Lebanese Shia who was with a broadly progressive left-leaning organization. And like many other individuals at the time in Lebanon, fighters from Fatah, he switches in 82 and he switches to the Iranian side and Hezbollah, and he becomes a absolute master of the dark arts of espionage, counter-espionage, the use of violence, terrorism, and so forth, for Iran and for Hezbollah. And that, again, is, and there are lots of other cases of the same people who switch when they see that the leftist stuff is not working. The PLO has been defeated in 82 in Lebanon. They switch very quickly to an alternative, a different way of achieving the same aims. In this case, it was fighting Israel and establishing an Islamist state.
Oh yeah, Eva.
Thanks a lot. It was really interesting, and I'm looking forward to read your book. So you showed these groups as being part, especially in the beginning of your story, as being part of a global left-wing revolutionist network. But you also emphasized that this ideological motivation was probably not central. So I was wondering if during your research you came across connecting points to right-wing extremism.
Just to clarify, I think that it's an international, but not a formal one in terms of the organizations and the alliances. I think there's a lot of for example, the vocabulary, if you like, visual and verbal is shared. I mean, they all use the same language about revolution, liberation. They use the same iconic images like Che. But what that actually means in specific contexts is often very different. And you see that when you get these Western volunteers, particularly, or trainees arriving in the PLO camps. I mean, there's the famous sort of Red Army faction example, but they're much better ones actually of individuals who turn up or groups that turn up, and their understanding of what revolution is completely different from the people on the ground. So I think there is the point I'm making is that at that time in the late 60s, everybody wanted a revolution. I mean, the Beatles were singing about it. So, actually singing about how they didn't want one, but not a violent one. That's why they're not a very good band. But anyway, so I just want to make that's clear. And a lot of them, I think, were ideological. I mean, I think many were deeply committed to to an idea, and they were genuinely idealistic. I mean, they genuinely thought in a way that we are now far too cynical to think of, is that revolution was possible. So I think they were idealistic in that sense. But the right wing stuff, yeah, bits and pieces. So some of the PLO people, particularly the one I spoke about, Ali Hassan Salami, had connections with, Adrian knows this better than me actually, but had connections with quite notorious, very right-wing figures. Otherwise, we've got people, there are a few kind of connections that you'll know about. We found there some in Beirut turn up. There's some 2 German neo-Nazis turn up in Beirut in 82. Not very many, but I mean, you're talking about really quite small numbers. And I mean, there's the question about Munich, and which I'll leave to you guys, but and the provision of the weapons and who was driving Abu Dawud around and all that, which we could look up. But otherwise, if you're talking about the other people I've looked at, like the JRA, the Japanese, or who else can I think of? None really. I mean, there's some ideological coincidence, but particularly when it comes to anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism, for that matter. But otherwise, not substantial.
Are there more questions? Yeah, David, Mike.
Yeah, thank you very much for this inspiring talk. I think we have laid a little bit of time to discuss more than just one question, but my question here would be kind of you have brought up one thing again and again, and I think this is one stable thing about the different transitions in this phase you talked about, is the role of media, or the specific role of media, even though it changed over time. So as an historian, I'm not an expert on the present, obviously, but I have still the feeling when we talk about nowadays that even the so-called social media has a big impact on the radicalization of young people within Europe, for example. So my question would be a little bit, if you think, or if you have thought about if there was also a failure of the media in the kind of how they dealt with this kind of terrorism at this time, especially when you talked about the fact that, the portrait of a terrorist is on the cover and he became like kind of a pop star. Do we need to talk more about the role of the media in the sense of moralic or kind of critical dealing with this, what happened there, and what do you think, especially when we also think about the new movie about the event in Munich. So I think this movie pretty much is addressing the role of the media in the sense of how they not just report, but how they report about it. So I would be interested about your thoughts.
It's still a real problem. It's a huge problem now. I mean, for all working journalists and reporters, and I think, in the 70s, it was a massive issue too. I mean, it was huge that, very famous novelists in this country were writing whole books about novels about, the media. And it was a huge thing that, was discussed by all the groups I think I've looked at. I think it's a good point. I mean, it's one of the things that they all talk about is the media, and particularly there's the kind of classic Marxist perspective of the media as misleading the masses and false consciousness, and without the media, the masses would rise up, and that their job as terrorists, which they wouldn't call themselves obviously, is to somehow shatter that false perception and reveal either the German government or the imperialist powers or whatever in their true light through violence. So I think media is absolutely core all the way through. It's not for nothing that it was, I think, 74 that Brian Jenkins, the still working actually US theorist, analyst of terrorism, first said terrorism is theatre. And that's always struck me as a really important thing to have said. The other part of your question was the media, did it somehow fail in not adequately dealing with, or more responsibly perhaps, dealing with terrorism? And I'd say yes, I mean, clearly. But my defense to all these things is the perhaps slightly simplistic argument that media, particularly in a democratic society, only works if it reflects the views and the values of the people who are reading it. And there's a symbiotic relationship between the readers and the media. So I think you could argue that there should have been a much more responsible position taken by the media on, say, Carlos. But then there wasn't a responsible position taken by, politicians or officials or anybody else. And there still isn't really on terrorism. I mean, for every one time that terrorism is irresponsibly treated by the media, which is frequent, there will be an official somewhere invoking security to justify something that has absolutely nothing to do with security whatsoever. So I think it's a problem that is definitely a deep one with the media representation of terrorism. But I think that problem goes well beyond just the media. But he's the expert.
Yeah, further. Would you agree that one could draw a line from what we see in Revolution Airport circa in September 1970, September 1972 Munich, when terrorism went live, to this day in early 2019 when some young guy in New Zealand walked into two mosques and was live streaming his attack in the internet, his attack on two mosques in New Zealand.
Absolutely. I mean, the nature of terrorism is that it needs publicity. I mean, otherwise, what's the point? So it's modern terrorism emerges in the late 19th century. There are various things that allow it to emerge, possibly dynamite, possibly other things. But one thing that's absolutely central is mass media. And I think it was very clear for those of us who were following, say, Islamist militancy during the 00s and the teens, 20 teens, how you could see it very clearly. You had another Munich moment, if you like, in 2006-07 when Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the then leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, started putting out hostage videos. And there was one moment, like literally 1 year, he had to do what bin Laden had been doing for 10, 15 years and so forth, and that's kind of deliver a video, a tape, to someone who is going to put it on air, right? And that's not dissimilar to what was happening in 70, 72. And this is what Haddad is continually talking about, Wadi Haddad and the PFLP. How do we convince a news editor somewhere to get our message across? How do we get on the television? Now, in 2006, 7, and 8, that was still the case. A terrorist still had to convince a gatekeeper, like a news editor, to put something in front of other people. 2 years later, 3 years later, internet, smartphones. There is no gatekeeper. They're not going out with a film. There's just a guy with a laptop, films it on his phone, and it goes straight to everybody. And that is as big a jump then as the live stream, probably bigger than the live stream from Munich was. And in a sense, we're talking about the responsibility of the journalists and all the rest of it, and the mainstream media. which is clearly there, but now is kind of, how much can we have like this much of bandwidth? So you could shut it all off, any reference from The Guardian or from anything else. What difference is it going to make? It'll be on TikTok. So in a sense, I mean, you're right to ask the question. It was a question for the 70s. So now, it's a more complicated media environment.
One final question, Claudia. Do we still have the mic?
Necessarily.
I think for the Zoomosphere.
Thank you for the interesting talk. I was wondering, talking about this role of the media in all of these different national contexts, how do you see kind of the exception of Japan, where the mass mediatization in 72 really led to the end of any revolutionary spirit for decades, and it kind of stopped a lot of what we would call like basic civic engagement through like demonstrations and things like that.
The which event?
So,
I know. Do you mean the snow murders and the mediatization of that?
Sorry?
Go on.
The hostage situation.
Yeah, the snow murders. Yeah, and that was amazing. 98% of the Japanese watched that. I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, this is where it's counterproductive, isn't it, for the terrorists, if you like, if we want to call them terrorists. I mean, the extremists, and that's also something that I've seen in other places too, and I've seen much more recently. Is the moment the actual reality of what it means is put before people, then the support tends to fall away very rapidly, particularly when it's your own people who are being killed or own policemen who are being shot on the corner and so forth. I mean, it happened in Germany at the same time. But that I think that showed. I mean, Japan was not in any way an outlier, or it was in that circumstance. I mean, that particular incident was very extreme, but it effectively, ended very quickly and dramatically any real broad support. I mean, in Germany, you saw a slower process of that, but it was still pretty fast. In US, at that period, there's a very narrow support anyway, but that had gone earlier, 71, 72. Where else? Italy is different with the Red Brigades, but still, you still get the same kind of gradient. And you could, where you get this kind of build up of legitimate grievances that are being aired, being blocked, then find a different route with an extremist part come into that space, a violent element. The violent element goes too far and undermines the entire support for the whole movement. I mean, that happened in Egypt in the 80s, 90s, particularly, Jordan in the OOs. In fact, virtually everywhere in the O's, Pakistan as well. And that's what you see in the post 9/11. You see this kind of wave of support and sympathy for the supposed mujahideen, the freedom fighters or whatever, sort of fighting. As long as they're fighting America, the moment the violence gets local and it's down the road and it's your policeman and it's your office and it's your school that could get hit or whatever, then the support tends to die away really fast. So I don't know if this answers a question, but I say that what you see in Japan in that period from 65 to 75 is a paradigmatic, example of exactly how mediatization can be very counterproductive, and also why it's really important to control or how useful it is to be able to control the way things are mediatized or broadcast, because the framing of that could have been, that particular incident was always going to kind of destroy the support. But I mean, other things can be framed differently, and when the governments can take or counter-terrorism forces can take back that media space, which I'd also argue they do in the 70s. By the 80s, they've reclaimed that space. Then it gets much more difficult for the extremists.
I think one interesting effect of the Snow murders is the transnationalization of the Japanese revolutionary movement, that you have the foundation of the Japanese Red Army not in Tokyo or in Sapporo, but in Beirut.
Yeah.
In 1972.
Because there's no space. The space is so squeezed.
Thank you so much for this talk. It was an absolute masterclass. I think we all learned a lot and have even more questions now in our heads.
Thank you, and apologies again for not being able to speak enough German to manage, but I had difficulty with the English, so let me try to do this. I'm admirative of your efforts, Adrian. But thank you all for coming. I hope you found it interesting. I did. Thank you for the questions.